It's been a somewhat common thing in cinema to see one actor play multiple roles, right? It's not that unheard of, and we've all seen Jack Nicholson try to be a president and a cowboy at the same time. It's kind of gimmicky, it kind of ruins the immersion, but one movie franchise that I think has an incredibly unappreciated actor is Back to the Future. There's actually several times they reuse actors for different roles, but I think you still get immersed in it pretty well because Marty and Doc, they're traveling through time. So acting like someone is portraying their older self or an ancestor, you kind of get away with it because obviously they're related, but in a different time form. And, I've seen older pictures of my mother who looked very much like my sister. So I think Back to the Future gets away with it a little easier. But one actor in Back to the Future that I think is insanely underrated is Thomas F. Wilson. You know him as Biff, right? Just kind of the basic high school bully. And at first glance, I think it's really easy to miss the amazing work this actor did in the trilogy because you just see him as such a basic character. He's the bad guy. But as the trilogy goes on, which I'm such a big fan of and I really enjoyed rewatching recently, I realized that this Thomas Wilson is able to create a new level of immersion and had a much more challenging job than the rest of the actors. Sure, Michael J. Fox had to play his, great-great-grandfather, and certain actors would just play themselves at different times in their life by putting on different makeup, but something about the vibe, something about the posture and the walking of Biff throughout the years, and having to play a middle-aged guy, an elderly guy in the future, as well as playing a futuristic child, and at the same time in the third movie wrapping it up with a westerner, an outlaw. And I several times throughout the trilogy forgot this was the same actor, especially in the third one. The youngish actor he plays in the future is a little bit more obvious, but I will admit he did a very good job changing his persona and especially his voice dependent on which character he was portraying, and he even had to play several versions of his middle-aged self. And again, it's very easy to forget that when they filmed Back to the Future, Biff was not middle-aged. He was a kid, and he was more on par with like a high school, college-age student, and yet he was somehow able to play so many different ages with so much range, whether he's the pushover in the great future that we end off in the first Back to the Future, whether it's the terrible future where he's basically pretending to be Donald Trump. Somehow, maybe he has a face that's better for it when it comes to makeup design, or maybe he's really good at manipulating his voice, but Tom is just able to bring such realism and such belief to these different characters throughout the trilogy that I genuinely forgot it's Tom Wilson the entire time. Particularly the way he walks, and especially the way he changes his voice in the third one as this outlaw westerner who's basically just a murderer working outside of the law. And Back to the Future has a very interesting way of making things dark and playful at the same time, which is why I think it's such a ironically timeless trilogy, despite, a lot of the future predictions not actually coming true. But I don't think that's what makes the trilogy interesting. In time travel movies in general, I always find interesting because of seeing what people thought the future may be like and seeing where they wrong is actually more fascinating. It would be somewhat cool if they got a lot of things correctly, but I think what's more interesting is to figure out how incorrect we are about the future, because that tells us a lot about how in the next 30 years we're not really going to know what's going to happen. So anyway, I'm a big fan of the trilogy, and I've seen lots of people talk about the movies before, and this character in particular, this actor, is even able to have conversations with himself, which feel really natural. In my opinion, they didn't feel cheesy, they didn't feel gimmicky. Maybe some people got that illusion, but in the second movie where young Biff is talking to old Biff from 2015, the conversations felt very legitimate. And what I found interesting about it, because throughout watching the Back to the Future trilogy, I've always wondered, if there was a time machine, if there was a DeLorean like this, what would a conversation with yourself be like? And of course, to avoid a disruption in the space-time continuum, Doc is always trying to tell Marty and even remind himself, hey, don't interact with yourself. That could cause a huge paradox. Do not tell yourself about the future and all that. And of course, because Marty and Doc are smart and they're trying to preserve the space-time continuum, they don't really interact with themselves very much at all, very briefly or without both parties knowing. Whereas Biff, once he finds out about the time machine in 2015, he instantly goes back to 1955 to let his younger self know, hey, by the way, this is this is totally how you become rich in the future, and make sure that you keep this booklet on you because it's really, really going to help you in the long term, and you need to believe me. And I love the dynamic that Biff had with himself. I thought that was really interesting because I think I can relate, and I think a lot of people can relate to the idea that your older self is almost a completely different person from your younger self. There may aesthetically be some similarities there, but frankly, from a personality standpoint, old Biff keeps reminding young Biff, hey, you're getting these metaphors wrong, you're mixing up your sentences, you're not making sense, and you're being an idiot. And I probably could say the same thing if, 80-year-old me met 18-year-old me. There'd probably be a bunch of things about my younger self that would drive my older self crazy. And I think Tom Wilson did an excellent job portraying that on screen in a way that felt believable and not just like one of those cheesy movies where one actor plays two parts and they kind of go back and forth, and maybe one of them has a mustache or one of them has a hat, and that's the deciding factor. But just in the way old Biff walks with a cane and how he leans hunched over and changes his voice dependent on his age, really, in my opinion, showcases the variety and the versatility of an actor, especially in one solid trilogy that, in my opinion, I've never really seen matched before. Feel free to comment down below if there's other actors that you think do a really, really good job portraying multiple characters and not just as voice actors. I think it's probably a lot easier to do as a voice actor because you don't have to be seen, but when you're giving it your all like Tom did, and you're giving your voice, your body, your looks, and also big shout out to the makeup and wardrobe team, which also I think helps with the immersion and making a character truly look like someone completely different despite it being the exact same actor. It's just an amazing thing to see on screen. A lot of the Back to the Future makeup did not age wonderfully, and some of the CG, while it is charming and I do think there's a lot of effort put into it, doesn't exactly age well in 2020. I think the makeup and the performances of Tom Wilson were probably the best in the entire series because they were the changes and they were the performances that went unnoticed throughout the whole thing. There's several actors playing multiple roles in Back to the Future, but they're pretty minor and they're pretty small changes. Michael J. Fox playing his great-great-grandfather is just like, okay, talk a little softer and you have a mustache now. But as soon as he shows up on screen, you instantly know, hey, look at that, Michael J. Fox. And that kind of distracts from the plot and what's going on in the story a little bit. Whereas Tom Wilson is playing the antagonist in every single chapter of the movie. While some people may have looked at it as cheesy, I found it somewhat realistic. If you truly had a time machine fall into the hands of the wrong person, this is probably exactly what they would do. They would get their younger self to become rich and powerful and unstoppable, which is why, as weird as it may have been to see Biff become leader of the free world, I think it's actually legitimate if a time machine like that actually existed. And he was able to portray a realistic character that was not just a cameo like other actors playing different characters. It wasn't just, hey, Jack Nicholson is playing two roles, haha, I can notice that. But this was actually different antagonists in different stages of their lives with different personalities and different voices, and yet at the same time, one actor making all of them come to life. And in my opinion, that deserves a whole lot more respect than we've given it in prior years. But what do you guys think? Am I giving Thomas Wilson too much credit, or did you think it was more cheesy than I'm making it out to be? Feel free to let me know down below. Thank you all for watching. Have an excellent rest of your day.